the frozen silence shattered like glass. What had begun as a routine morning at the Hürtgen Forest defensive line turned into Oberleutnant Friedrich Conrad's most horrific memory. His meticulously positioned machine gun nests, the pride of his defensive strategy, fell silent one by one as American soldiers, wielding what appeared to be ordinary rifles, cut down his men with an unprecedented rate of fire. "They're firing too fast," screamed his radio operator, panic evident in his voice. "How can they reload so quickly?" In that moment, as the morning fog mixed with gunpowder, Conrad witnessed firsthand the devastating impact of America's secret weapon, the M1 Garand, the world's first standard-issue, semi-automatic infantry rifle that was changing the face of battlefield tactics forever. Before we dive into this extraordinary story, tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? It's incredible to see our historical community spread across the world. And if you're new here, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Each subscription helps us continue unearthing these fascinating stories that shaped our world. Now, let's get to the story. The date was November 16, 1944. The Allied forces had been pushing steadily through Europe following the successful D-Day landings. Yet in the dense ancient woods of the Hürtgen Forest, the war had devolved into a brutal stalemate. The German Wehrmacht had transformed this stretch of woodland along the Belgian-German border into a deadly defensive labyrinth. Artillery pre-sighted on every clearing, machine gun positions covering every approach, mines and booby traps turning the forest floor into a death trap. For the Americans, the Hürtgen represented one of the toughest challenges of the European campaign. That morning, as frost still clung to the barren tree branches, elements of the U.S. 4th Infantry Division prepared to advance through a section of forest that intelligence had identified as a potential weak point in the German lines. Among these troops was Technical Sergeant Paul Hendricks, a 26-year-old former hardware store clerk from Ohio. Like his fellow infantrymen, Hendricks carried what General George Patton would later call the greatest battle implement ever devised, the M1 Garand rifle. The tactical superiority of this weapon remained largely underestimated by German officers who had yet to face concentrated American infantry fire. Most were still operating under the assumption that American soldiers carried bolt-action rifles similar to their own Carabiner 98K. The devastating reality of American firepower would reveal itself to Oberleutnant Conrad in the coming minutes. Friedrich Conrad, 28, had earned the Knight's Cross for his leadership on the Eastern Front before being transferred to shore up the Western defenses. A career officer from a military family in Bavaria, Conrad prided himself on defensive tactics, particularly in difficult terrain. When assigned to the Hürtgen, he meticulously developed interlocking fields of fire, creating what he believed was an impenetrable defense with his limited resources. His company had successfully repelled 3 previous American probing attacks, reinforcing his confidence in his tactical judgment. The American attack began with the standard artillery barrage, which Conrad's men weathered in their reinforced positions. From his command post in a converted hunting cabin, Conrad observed through binoculars as the shells rained down, noting with professional detachment that the bombardment was lighter than previous engagements. This concerned him. A lighter barrage often meant a larger infantry push would follow. He radioed his forward positions, ensuring they were alert and reminding them of ammunition conservation protocols. In 1944, with Germany's manufacturing capabilities under constant Allied bombing, every bullet had to count. As the barrage lifted, the forest fell into an eerie silence. Conrad's men, veterans all, waited with fingers on triggers. The first sign of the American advance came when forward observers reported movement through the morning mist. Following doctrine, Conrad held his machine guns, the MG-42s with their devastating 1,200 rounds per minute rate of fire, until the Americans were well into the killing zone he had established. Wait until they're within 200 meters, he had instructed his gunners. Make every burst count. When the first Americans appeared through the mist, moving in disciplined formations from tree to tree, Conrad gave the order. The distinctive ripping sound of the MG-42s, which Allied troops had nicknamed Hitler's buzzsaw, tore through the forest. In previous engagements, this opening salvo had typically pinned down the American forces, forcing them into cover and allowing German riflemen to pick off anyone who moved. But something was different this time. Instead of diving for cover and remaining there, the American troops dropped momentarily, quickly identified the German positions from their muzzle flashes, and began returning fire at an alarming rate. The distinctive ping of the M1 Garands and block clip being ejected, a sound that would become seared into the memory of every German soldier who faced American infantry, echoed through the trees. Technical Sergeant Hendricks directed his squad's fire toward the nearest machine gun nest. Unlike bolt-action rifles that required the soldier to manually eject a spent cartridge and chamber a new round after each shot, the M1 allowed him to fire 8 rounds as fast as he could pull the trigger. When his clip was empty, a simple push of a new clip into the receiver meant he was ready to fire again in under 2 seconds. "Target the gunner, 2 o'clock, fallen log," Hendricks shouted to his Bar Browning automatic rifleman, while he himself fired steadily at the German position, the semi-automatic Garand, allowing him to maintain accurate suppressive fire. In his command post, Conrad watched with growing alarm as 3 of his machine gun positions fell silent within minutes. His radio man was frantically trying to raise the forward positions. "Feldwebel Mayer's position is overrun," the radio operator reported, his face pale. "They say the Americans are firing too fast, not like before." Conrad grabbed his binoculars again. What he saw contradicted everything he understood about infantry engagements. The American soldiers weren't carrying specialized weapons. They all had what appeared to be standard rifles. Yet they were generating a volume of fire that his men, equipped with bolt-action carabiner 98Ks, couldn't match. The Americans could fire 5 to 8 rounds in the time it took his riflemen to fire twice. The technical specifications of the M1 Garand had transformed the tactical reality on the ground. Developed by Canadian-American designer John Cantius Garand at Springfield Armory in Massachusetts, the rifle had entered service in 1936, making the United States the first nation to widely issue a semi-automatic rifle as standard infantry equipment. Chambered for the powerful 30-06 Springfield cartridge, the M1 weighed about 9.5 pounds, 4.3 kilodolars, with an effective firing range of 500 yards. Its 8-round on-block clip allowed for rapid reloading, and its gas-operated rotating bolt mechanism meant that soldiers could maintain their sight picture between shots, dramatically improving accuracy during rapid fire. In contrast, Conrad's men carried the Carabiner 98K, a refined version of the Gewehr 98 design from World War I. While accurate and reliable, it required the soldier to manually operate the bolt between each shot, significantly reducing the rate of fire and forcing the shooter to break their cheek weld and sight picture. In practiced hands, it could fire 15 rounds per minute, but the Garand could easily double that rate while maintaining better accuracy. As the morning wore on, this disparity in firepower began to tell. Conrad's defensive line, designed to repel attacks based on the assumption of comparable infantry weapons, was being systematically dismantled. His men, trained to fire deliberately and conserve ammunition, were being overwhelmed by the sheer volume of accurate American fire. "They're flanking the 2nd platoon position," came another frantic radio message. Conrad knew that his carefully constructed defense was unraveling. The interlocking fields of fire became meaningless if multiple positions could be suppressed simultaneously by regular infantry. "Bring the mortars to bear on grid reference H7, he ordered, hoping to slow the American advance with indirect fire while he reorganized his defenses. But even as the first mortar rounds fell, the Americans were moving forward, using the superior firepower of their Garands to maintain suppressive fire on the German positions. By mid-morning, what Conrad had expected to be another routine defense of his sector had turned into a desperate fight for survival. His company, which had begun the day at approximately 80% strength, was now reduced to less than half that. Several platoons reported being down to their last boxes of ammunition, having expended far more than planned trying to counter the American rate of fire. "We need reinforcements and resupply," Conrad radioed to battalion headquarters. The response was not encouraging. "Hold your position with available resources," came the reply. "No reserves available for commitment at this time." The reality of Germany's strategic situation in late 1944 was starkly illustrated in this brief exchange. While American factories were producing the advanced M1 Garand by the millions, German manufacturing was struggling to replace even basic equipment. While American units received regular resupply, German units were increasingly told to make do with what they had or scavenge from the battlefield. Technical Sergeant Hendricks and his squad had now pushed 400 meters into what had been German-controlled territory. The distinctive sound of German MG-42s, which had initially been so threatening, had diminished as position after position was neutralized. The squad moved with practiced efficiency, using fire and movement techniques that maximized the advantages of their Garands. "First squad, covering fire!" Hendricks called out. Immediately, half his men began firing at suspected German positions, the combined effect of their semi-automatic rifles creating a wall of suppressive fire that kept the defenders' heads down. "Second squad, move up!" The second element of his unit dashed forward 30 meters to a new position of cover, then began firing to allow the first squad to advance. This leapfrogging technique was far more effective with M1 Garands than it would have been with bolt-action rifles, as each moving group had substantial covering fire from a smaller number of supporting troops. In his increasingly isolated command post, Oberleutnant Conrad was facing the most difficult decision of his military career. His company was being systematically destroyed by an enemy with superior firepower. The American advance had already compromised his main line of defense, and continued resistance would likely result in the complete annihilation of his command. Military doctrine and German policy in 1944 demanded that he fight to the last man. Officers who surrendered their commands faced potential court-martial or worse. Yet Conrad was a practical soldier who had survived 3 years on the Eastern Front by knowing when tactical withdrawal was necessary. "Prepare for fighting withdrawal to secondary positions," he ordered over the radio. "Platoons will disengage by sections, maintaining covering fire." Even this controlled retreat proved challenging against the American Garands. As each section of German troops attempted to break contact, the Americans were able to lay down accurate fire that kept them pinned or inflicted casualties. The superior rate of fire meant that even as the Germans retreated, they were unable to generate enough suppressive fire to move safely. By early afternoon, what remained of Conrad's company had fallen back nearly a kilometer, abandoning carefully prepared positions and equipment in a retreat that threatened to become a rout. The psychological impact on his men was evident. They had entered combat confident in their defensive preparations and tactical training, only to be overwhelmed by the basic infantry weapon of their enemy. For Technical Sergeant Hendricks and the advancing Americans, the battle represented a validation of their equipment and training. Despite facing prepared defenses in difficult terrain, they had broken through with relatively light casualties compared to earlier engagements in the Hürtgen Forest. The M1 Garand had proven its worth yet again, allowing ordinary infantry to generate firepower that previously would have required specialized weapons. As the November day began to wane, with early darkness falling over the forest, the Americans consolidated their gains. Hendricks oversaw the establishment of defensive positions, knowing that German counterattacks often came at night. His men dug in, set up observation posts, and prepared fields of fire, all while maintaining a healthy respect for German tactics and determination. In a field hospital 10 kilometers behind the new front line, Oberleutnant Conrad sat with a bandage around his arm, having sustained a flesh wound during the withdrawal. Around him lay many of his men in far worse condition. The battalion commander, a major who had spent most of the war behind a desk in Berlin, was berating him for abandoning his position. "You had specific orders to hold at all costs," the major said, his face flushed with anger. "Explain yourself, Oberleutnant." Conrad looked up at the officer, exhaustion etched into his face. "With respect, Herr Major, we faced a new tactical reality today. The Americans have rifles that fire as fast as they can pull the trigger. Every one of their infantrymen carries this weapon. We couldn't generate enough fire to keep them suppressed with our bolt-action rifles." The major scoffed. "Nonsense. A rifle is a rifle. It was your tactical deployment that was flawed." Conrad knew better than to argue further. The major, like many staff officers, was still fighting the war as it had existed in 1940 or 1941. He hadn't experienced firsthand how technological advantages like the M1 Garand were shifting the balance on the battlefield. The reality was that the M1 Garand represented more than just an incremental improvement in infantry weapons. It symbolized the industrial and technological advantage that the United States brought to bear in the war, an advantage that was becoming increasingly evident as the conflict progressed. While Germany had focused on developing wonder weapons like the V-2 rocket and jet aircraft, the Americans had methodically upgraded the basic tools of warfare, putting superior equipment in the hands of every soldier. That night, as both sides prepared for the next day's combat, Technical Sergeant Hendricks cleaned his Garand by the light of a shielded flashlight. The rifle had performed flawlessly during the day's fighting, as he had come to expect. Around him, his men did the same, their confidence in their equipment reinforced by the day's success. Meanwhile, in what remained of his command, Oberleutnant Conrad wrote reports and planned for the defense of his new position, with the grim knowledge that his men were outgunned at the most basic level. No amount of tactical brilliance could fully compensate for the fact that each American infantryman could fire 3 to 4 times as rapidly as his German counterpart, while maintaining better accuracy. The story of that November day in the Hürtgen forest would be repeated across the Western Front as American forces pressed their advance toward Germany. While the M1 Garand was just one factor among many that contributed to Allied victory, its impact on day-to-day infantry combat was profound. German soldiers who survived the war would often mention the distinctive ping sound of the Garand's clip being ejected as one of their most haunting memories, the sound that told them American infantrymen were reloading and would soon resume their devastating fire. For firearms design and military doctrine, the lessons of encounters like the one between Conrad's company and Hendricks's troops were clear. The era of the bolt-action rifle as a standard infantry weapon was over. Future conflicts would be fought with semi-automatic and automatic weapons as all major powers raced to equip their forces with firearms that could match or exceed the capabilities of the M1 Garand. The following morning dawned cold and clear over the Hürtgen forest. The advance would continue, with American troops pushing forward behind the firepower of their Garands, gradually forcing the German defenders back despite their determination and tactical skill. The personal duel between Technical Sergeant Hendricks and Oberleutnant Conrad would continue as well, though neither man knew the other's name or face. 2 weeks later, as American forces secured another kilometer of the bitterly contested forest, a patrol from Hendricks' unit discovered an abandoned German command post in a small hunting cabin. Among the hastily discarded papers and equipment was a tactical notebook belonging to a German officer. Inside, written in meticulous German script, was an analysis of American infantry tactics and weapons. Several pages were devoted to the M1 Garand, with detailed observations about its rate of fire, accuracy, and the tactical advantages it provided to American troops. The last entry, dated December 1st, 1944, read, "Our men fight with courage and skill, but we cannot match the firepower of the American infantry. Each of their soldiers carries a weapon that allows him to fire like a small machine gun. Until our forces are similarly equipped, We must adapt our tactics to compensate for this disadvantage. The days of frontal infantry engagements are over for us. The notebook made its way back through intelligence channels, eventually reaching officers responsible for analyzing German tactics and morale. It provided valuable confirmation of what many already suspected, that the M1 Garand had created a significant tactical advantage for American forces at the squad and platoon level. For Hendricks and his men, however, the war continued without knowledge of this validation. They fought on through the Hürtgen forest, facing determined German resistance every step of the way. The advantage provided by their Garands was real, but it didn't make them invulnerable. Many would fall to German artillery, mines, and the occasional sniper. Reminders that technological superiority could reduce casualties, but never eliminate them entirely in the brutal arithmetic of infantry combat. By mid-December, just as American forces were beginning to break through the last organized German defenses in the Hürtgen, the strategic situation changed dramatically with the launch of the German Ardennes offensive, what would later become known as the Battle of the Bulge. Many units, including elements of Hendricks' division, were redirected to counter this unexpected German thrust. The fighting in the densely wooded Ardennes would once again demonstrate the value of the M1 Garand in close-quarters combat, where its rapid fire capability allowed American troops to generate overwhelming firepower during brief engagements between small units in limited visibility. Even as German forces achieved tactical surprise and initial success in the offensive, the fundamental firepower advantage at the infantry level remained with the Americans. For Oberleutnant Conrad, the war took a different turn. Recognized for his tactical acumen despite the loss of his original position, he was reassigned to help train Volkssturm units, the hastily organized militia formed from men previously considered too young, too old, or too essential for military service. Now, as Germany faced invasion on two fronts, these last reserves were being called up. The cruel irony was not lost on Conrad as he attempted to teach basic infantry tactics to elderly men and teenagers armed with a motley collection of outdated rifles, some dating back to the previous century. These inadequately trained and equipped units would soon face American troops carrying the weapons that had overwhelmed his veteran company. In a training session near Dresden in January 1945, Conrad tried to explain the reality of combat against American infantry to a group of Volkssturm recruits. They carry rifles that fire as fast as they can pull the trigger, he told them. You must use terrain for cover and avoid direct engagements whenever possible. An elderly man, a veteran of the First World War, raised his hand. In my war we faced machine guns and artillery. How can rifles be so dangerous? Conrad looked at the man, remembering his own similar thoughts before that fateful November morning in the Hürtgen. Because every American infantryman effectively carries a light machine gun, he replied, and they have the ammunition to use them as such. As winter turned to spring in 1945, the war in Europe approached its inevitable conclusion. American, British, and Soviet forces pressed into Germany from west and east. The technological and industrial advantages of the Allies, exemplified by weapons like the M1 Garand, had combined with their numerical superiority to create an unstoppable momentum. In April 1945, Technical Sergeant Hendricks found himself leading his squad through the rubble-strewn streets of a small German town. The organized resistance they had faced in places like the Hürtgen forest had largely given way to sporadic fighting against Volkssturm units and die-hard SS elements. His Garand, which had served him faithfully across hundreds of kilometers of European battlefields, remained his constant companion. Unknown to Hendricks, Oberleutnant Conrad was just 20 kilometers away, having been recalled from his training duties to help organize the defense of the approaches to Dresden. With the Soviet armies closing in from the east, Conrad had been ordered to hold until the civilian population could be evacuated westward, ideally into areas that would be occupied by American rather than Soviet forces. As he surveyed the hastily established defensive positions, Conrad thought back to that November day in the Hurtgen when his world had changed. The lessons he had learned then had stayed with him, informing his tactical decisions and likely saving the lives of many men under his command in subsequent engagements. Now, facing the final collapse of the Third Reich, Conrad understood that no tactical brilliance or individual heroism could change the outcome. The industrial might of the United States, which had produced over 5.4 million M1 Garands during the war, had created an imbalance that could not be overcome by even the most determined resistance. The impact of the M1 Garand on the battlefield had been recognized at the highest levels of German command. As early as 1943, after facing American troops in North Africa and Italy, German ordnance officers had begun developing their own semi-automatic rifle, the Gewehr 43, later Karabiner 43, partly in response to the American weapon. However, manufacturing difficulties and material shortages meant that only about 400,000 were produced, less than 10% of Garand production. Most German infantry continued to rely on the Karabiner 98K throughout the war. In a strange twist of fate, the two men whose lives had been so dramatically affected by the M1 Garand would never meet, yet their final wartime experiences would be connected by the weapon that had changed modern infantry combat. On April 25, 1945, as Soviet forces approached Dresden, Oberleutnant Conrad made the difficult decision to surrender what remained of his battle group to advancing American forces rather than face capture by the Soviets. Leading a column of both military personnel and civilians, he approached American lines near the Mulde River, which temporarily marked the boundary between American and Soviet zones of advance. The American unit that received his surrender was part of the same division that had broken through his defenses in the Hurtgen forest months earlier, though neither side recognized the connection. As Conrad presented his sidearm to the American captain, he noticed the M1 Garands carried by the infantry, providing security, the same weapons that had overwhelmed his company in November. "Your rifle," Conrad said to one of the American soldiers, pointing to the Garand. "It changed the war for me?" The soldier, who happened to be none other than Technical Sergeant Hendricks, looked at the German officer with curiosity. "How's that, sir?" he asked, the "sir" coming automatically despite the man being an enemy officer. "In the Hurtgen," Conrad explained. "November, we couldn't match your rate of fire. Every time we thought we had you pinned down, you would overwhelm us with rifle fire. It was a revelation." Hendricks nodded slowly, memories of that bitter fighting returning. "The Garand made a difference," he acknowledged, "but we still lost a lot of good men in those woods." This brief exchange between two professional soldiers who had fought on opposite sides of the same battlefield encapsulated the mixed legacy of the M1 Garand. It had provided a significant tactical advantage to American forces, likely shortening the war and potentially saving lives on both sides by making prolonged resistance futile. Yet it remained just one factor in the complex and devastating equation of modern warfare, where technology, tactics, logistics, and human courage all played vital roles. As Conrad was processed into a prisoner of war camp, and Hendricks continued with his unit toward its final objectives of the war, the story of the M1 Garand was already transitioning from current events to military history. Its impact would be studied in staff colleges and military academies around the world in the post-war years, informing the development of infantry weapons and tactics for decades to come. The lessons learned from weapons like the M1 Garand would influence the design of virtually every service rifle developed after World War II. The Soviet AK-47, the American M14, a direct development of the Garand, and later M16, the German G3, the British L1A1, all would incorporate the principle that infantry needed to be able to generate sustained, accurate fire without the limitations imposed by manual bolt operation. The broader historical significance of the M1 Garand extended beyond its technical specifications or tactical advantages. It represented a philosophical approach to warfare that prioritized equipping the individual soldier with the best possible tools, recognizing that ultimately wars are won by the actions of men on the ground, regardless of the technologies deployed in the air or at sea. For Technical Sergeant Hendricks, the war ended in May 1945 with Germany's unconditional surrender. He returned to Ohio bringing his combat experiences and memories, though like many veterans, he rarely spoke about them. He would occasionally visit the range to fire sporting rifles, but never again handled an M1 Garand, the weapon that had been his constant companion through some of the most intense experiences of his life. Oberleutnant Conrad spent 18 months in an American POW camp in France before being repatriated to Germany in late 1946. Unlike many former Wehrmacht officers who minimized the significance of American contributions to the Allied victory, focusing instead on the overwhelming numbers of the Soviets, Conrad maintained that technological advantages at the tactical level, exemplified by the M1 Garand, had been decisive in the West. In the decades following the war, as both NATO and Warsaw Pact forces prepared for a potential conflict across the same European landscapes where World War II had been fought, the lessons of weapons like the M1 Garand remained relevant. The basic infantry rifle had evolved from a single-shot or bolt-action weapon into a semi-automatic or selective fire system, capable of generating substantial firepower in the hands of individual soldiers. The specific encounter between Conrad's company and Hendricks's troops in the Hürtgen Forest was just one of thousands of similar engagements across the European theater. But it illustrated the practical impact of the M1 Garand on daily combat operations. In the dense forests, urban environments, and broken terrain of Europe, the ability to generate rapid, accurate fire often made the difference between success and failure at the small unit level. The story of the M1 Garand also highlights the importance of seemingly mundane technological advantages in warfare. While history often focuses on dramatic innovations like radar, jet aircraft, or atomic weapons, the incremental improvement represented by replacing bolt-action rifles with semi-automatic ones had an immediate and tangible effect on the daily reality of combat for millions of soldiers. In 1995, 50 years after the end of World War II, an aging Paul Hendricks attended a veterans reunion in Washington, D.C. During a visit to the Smithsonian's Military History Collection, he found himself standing before a display case containing an M1 Garand. The placard described it as the standard U.S. service rifle of World War II, the first semi-automatic rifle to be widely issued to infantry forces. As Hendricks stood looking at the weapon, a museum docent approached. "Did you carry one of these, sir?" the young man asked, noting Hendricks's veteran's cap. "I did," Hendricks replied, "from Normandy to Czechoslovakia." "What did you think of it?" the docent inquired. Hendricks was silent for a moment, considering the question. "It kept me alive," he finally said, "and it helped end the war sooner." What more could you ask of a rifle? That same year, in a small town near Dresden, in the reunified Germany, Friedrich Conrad, now in his late 70s, was being interviewed by a military historian researching the fighting in the Hürtgen Forest. The historian had tracked down Conrad through old Wehrmacht records, interested in his perspective as a company commander during those brutal engagements. The American M1 rifle, Conrad told the historian, was perhaps the most significant advantage their infantry had over ours. We had been taught that the individual rifleman should fire deliberately, making each shot count. This was necessary with bolt-action rifles, but the Americans could maintain accurate fire at 3 or 4 times our rate. It forced us to completely reconsider our tactical approach. When asked if he believed better equipment alone had decided the outcome of the war, Conrad shook his head. No, courage and skill always matter in battle, but when technological advantage aligns with numerical superiority and industrial capacity, as it did for the Allies, the outcome becomes inevitable. The M1 Garand simply hastened that inevitability, and likely saved lives on both sides by making prolonged resistance futile. The historical assessment of the M1 Garand's impact continues to evolve as military historians gain access to more primary sources and develop more sophisticated analyses of infantry combat effectiveness. While some modern scholars argue that its advantages have been overstated in popular accounts, few dispute that it represented a significant advancement in infantry weapons technology that influenced all subsequent service rifle development. For the generation of American soldiers who carried it into battle across North Africa, Italy, France, Belgium, and Germany, the M1 Garand remains a powerful symbol of American industrial and technological prowess applied to the grim necessities of warfare. Veterans like Hendricks rarely speak about the weapon in technical terms, instead focusing on its reliability, stopping power, and the confidence it gave them, knowing they could generate substantial firepower when needed. German veterans who faced the M1 Garand in combat, like Oberleutnant Conrad, often mention it as one of several technological surprises they encountered fighting American forces. Along with the abundance of artillery, air support, motorized transport, and material supplies, the superior infantry rifle contributed to the impression of an enemy with seemingly limitless resources. The technical specifications that made the M1 Garand so effective were the result of over a decade of development and refinement. John Cantius Garand, a Canadian-born engineer working at Springfield Armory in Massachusetts, began developing the rifle in 1924, and it went through numerous iterations before being officially adopted in 1936. Its gas-operated semi-automatic mechanism was revolutionary for its time, especially in a full-power battle rifle firing the .30-06 Springfield cartridge. The 8-round en-bloc clip system, which caused the distinctive ping sound when ejected, was a compromise solution to the feeding issues that had plagued earlier designs. While sometimes criticized for alerting the enemy when a soldier had emptied his rifle, in practice the noise was rarely audible in combat conditions, and the rapid reloading capability more than compensated for any theoretical disadvantage. The M1's sights, consisting of an aperture rear sight and a protected front blade, were significantly better than those on many contemporary rifles, contributing to its accuracy in field conditions. American infantry training emphasized aimed semi-automatic fire rather than volume alone, making the most of both the weapon's rate of fire and its inherent accuracy. Maintenance was another area where the Garand excelled. Despite its more complex mechanism compared to bolt-action rifles, it proved remarkably reliable in the harsh conditions of combat. Its design allowed for quick disassembly in the field without special tools, and its tolerances were engineered to accommodate the dust, mud, and general abuse of infantry operations. All these technical advantages translated into real tactical benefits for American infantry units. The ability to maintain accurate fire while advancing, to quickly suppress enemy positions, and to generate overwhelming firepower during critical moments of an engagement gave them options that their opponents, limited by bolt-action rifles, simply did not have. The production of the M1 Garand was itself a triumph of American industrial capacity. From 1936 to the end of the war, Springfield Armory and Winchester Repeating Arms Company produced over 5.4 million of these rifles, enough to equip the entire U.S. Army and Marine Corps infantry forces with plenty of replacements available. In contrast, Germany's attempt to develop and field a comparable weapon, the Gewehr 43, was hampered by material shortages, manufacturing difficulties, and the disruption caused by Allied bombing of production facilities. The relatively small number, produced approximately 400,000, meant that they were typically issued only to specialized units or as designated marksman rifles, rather than becoming standard infantry equipment. This disparity in production capability highlights a fundamental aspect of World War II that transcended any single weapon system. The United States' ability to design, produce, and field advanced equipment in enormous quantities ultimately overwhelmed the Axis powers, who could not match this industrial output, despite often having technical expertise and manufacturing skill. The legacy of the M1 Garand extended far beyond World War II. It remained the standard service rifle of the U.S. military until the adoption of the M14 in 1957, seeing further combat in the Korean War and the early stages of American involvement in Vietnam. Even after its official replacement, it continued to serve with Reserve and National Guard units into the 1970s. Internationally, the M1 was provided to numerous allied and friendly nations through military aid programs during the Cold War. Countries from Greece to South Korea used it as either a standard service rifle or a second-line weapon. Some remain in use for ceremonial purposes or with reserve forces to this day. The technical legacy of the Garand is evident in its direct descendant, the M14 rifle, which modified the basic design to accept a 20-round detachable magazine and added selective fire capability. Elements of Garand's design principles can be traced through subsequent generations of battle rifles and even into modern assault rifles, though the latter represent a different philosophy of infantry armament based around intermediate power cartridges. For military historians and weapons experts, the M1 Garand represents a watershed moment in the evolution of infantry weapons, the point at which the semi-automatic rifle became the standard rather than the exception. Its success validated the concept of equipping regular infantry with more complex but more capable weapons, establishing a pattern that continues to this day. The human stories connected to the M1 Garand, like those of Technical Sergeant Hendricks and Oberleutnant Conrad, provide a window into understanding how technological advantages translate to tactical realities on the battlefield. Each engagement where American Garands faced German carabiners represented a microcosm of the larger industrial and technological disparities that helped determine the war's outcome. By 1944, when our story takes place in the Hürtgen Forest, the practical effects of the M1 Garand had been felt across multiple theaters of war. Veterans of campaigns in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy had already developed tactics that maximized its advantages. New replacements arriving in Europe were trained specifically to exploit the firepower superiority it provided at the squad level. For men like Hendricks, the Garand wasn't just a weapon. It was a lifeline and a force multiplier that allowed a small unit to generate combat power far beyond what their numbers would suggest. The confidence this gave American infantrymen translated into more aggressive tactics and a willingness to close with and destroy the enemy, knowing they possessed a crucial advantage in the most fundamental infantry weapon. For German officers like Conrad, the M1 Garand represented a challenge that required constant tactical adaptation. Defensive positions had to be more deeply echeloned, with greater emphasis on obstacles and indirect fire to compensate for the disadvantage in direct firefights. Machine guns became even more vital as force multipliers, their high volume of fire necessary to counter the semi-automatic rifles of advancing American infantry. As the war in Europe approached its final stages in spring 1945, the accumulated advantages of weapons like the M1 Garand, multiplied across millions of soldiers, had helped create an unstoppable Allied momentum. While no single factor determined the outcome of such a complex conflict, the superior infantry weapons of American forces certainly contributed to their combat effectiveness and ultimately to victory. In the decades following World War II, military planners around the world absorbed the lessons demonstrated by the M1 Garand. The era of bolt-action rifles as standard infantry weapons came to a decisive end, replaced by semi-automatic and later selective fire designs. The principle that individual riflemen needed to generate substantial firepower became a cornerstone of infantry doctrine globally. The specific encounter between Conrad's company and Hendricks's troops in the Hürtgen Forest might appear insignificant in the grand strategic narrative of World War II, yet it perfectly illustrates how large-scale industrial and technological advantages manifested at the tactical level, where the war was ultimately won or lost, in countless small engagements between opposing infantry units. For the soldiers who experienced these engagements firsthand, the technical specifications of their weapons translated into life-or-death realities. The M1 Garand's 8-round en-bloc clip, gas-operated semi-automatic action, and quick-change barrel system weren't just engineering details. They were features that kept men alive and allowed them to accomplish their missions under the most challenging conditions imaginable. This perspective helps explain why veterans like Hendricks and Conrad, decades after the war, still spoke about the M1 Garand with a mixture of respect and awe. They had witnessed directly how a seemingly incremental improvement in infantry weapons could dramatically alter the dynamics of combat at the most fundamental level. In May 2000, 5 years after his interview with the German historian, Friedrich Conrad passed away peacefully at his home near Dresden. Among his personal effects, his family found a small notebook, the same tactical journal he had kept during the war. The final entry, dated April 30, 1945, just days before Germany's surrender, contained a reflection on his experiences. As I prepare to surrender what remains of my command, I find myself thinking not of grand strategy or political failures, but of practical realities that shaped our defeat. The American semi-automatic rifle stands foremost among these. Had our infantry been similarly equipped from the beginning, many tactical situations might have developed differently. This is not to suggest the outcome would have changed. Their material superiority was too great, but perhaps the path would have been different. I have learned that in modern war, the quality of the basic infantryman's equipment is as important as his training and motivation. This lesson should not be forgotten by future generations. Paul Hendricks lived until 2008, reaching the age of 90. In his later years, he occasionally spoke to school groups about his wartime experiences, though like many veterans, he focused more on the bonds formed with his fellow soldiers than on the fighting itself. When asked about the M1 Garand by curious students, he would simply say, "It was the best rifle in the war, and we were lucky to have it." The technical superiority of the M1 Garand represented more than just a military advantage. It embodied the industrial and engineering prowess that the United States brought to bear in World War II. While German weapons were often excellent and sometimes technically superior in isolation, American industry produced quality equipment in quantities that the Axis powers simply could not match. This production miracle extended far beyond rifles. While each M1 Garand represented a tactical advantage for the individual soldier carrying it, the fact that millions were manufactured and distributed represented a strategic advantage that helped determine the war's outcome. The same pattern applied to tanks, aircraft, ships, and every other category of war materiel. The story of Oberleutnant Conrad's fateful encounter with American M1 Garands in the Hürtgen Forest illuminates an often overlooked aspect of warfare, how seemingly small technical advantages can cascade into significant tactical disparities. The semi-automatic operation of the Garand might seem like a modest improvement over bolt-action rifles, but when multiplied across an entire infantry squad or platoon, it created a firepower advantage that could overwhelm carefully prepared defenses. This reality continues to influence military procurement and doctrine to the present day. Modern infantry weapons are evaluated not just on their individual performance characteristics, but on how they will function as part of an integrated combat system. The lesson of the M1 Garand, that equipping the individual soldier with the best possible tools pays dividends far beyond their cost, remains relevant in contemporary conflicts worldwide. For military historians, the transition from bolt action to semi-automatic rifles represents one of the most significant developments in 20th century infantry combat. The M1 Garand stands as the pioneering implementation of this concept on a mass scale, proving that such weapons could be manufactured in enormous quantities, distributed to general infantry rather than specialist troops, and maintained under the harsh conditions of frontline combat. The personal experiences of men like Hendricks and Conrad provide essential context for understanding this transition. Through their eyes, we can appreciate how technological developments translated into tactical realities, and how those tactical shifts contributed to the larger strategic narrative of the war. Their story reminds us that behind every statistical analysis of production figures or technical comparison of weapon specifications lie the experiences of individual soldiers whose lives were directly affected by these factors. In the dense forests of eastern Belgium and western Germany, where visibility was often limited to tens rather than hundreds of meters, the advantages of the M1 Garand were particularly pronounced. The ability to maintain accurate fire without manually operating a bolt mechanism meant that American infantrymen could keep their eyes on the target area continuously, spotting movement and responding immediately. This was precisely the scenario that unfolded when Hendricks's troops engaged Conrad's defensive positions in November 1944. Military analysts studying the Hürtgen Forest campaign have identified numerous factors that made it particularly challenging for both attackers and defenders. The limited visibility, difficult terrain, cold and wet conditions, and the German use of pre-registered artillery targets. Against these obstacles, the firepower advantage provided by the M1 Garand became even more significant, allowing American troops to generate the volume of fire necessary to overcome prepared defenses despite adverse conditions. The encounter between Conrad's company and Hendrick's troops represented just one of thousands of similar engagements that occurred as American forces pushed into Germany in late 1944 and early 1945. Each followed a similar pattern. German defenders, often skilled and determined, found themselves overwhelmed by the combination of firepower, material resources, and tactical proficiency that American units brought to bear. By spring 1945, as the war in Europe approached its conclusion, the cumulative effect of these advantages had become insurmountable. German forces, lacking adequate equipment, ammunition, and fuel, could no longer mount effective resistance against Allied advances on either front. The story of the M1 Garand and its impact represents one thread in this larger tapestry of Allied material superiority. In the decades following World War II, as military historians gained access to more primary sources and developed more sophisticated analytical tools, the assessment of weapons like the M1 Garand became more nuanced. While acknowledging its significant advantages, modern scholarship also recognizes that no single weapon system determined the outcome of such a complex conflict. Rather, the Garand exemplified a systematic approach to equipping and training infantry forces that maximized their combat effectiveness. For the veterans who carried it into battle, however, the M1 Garand remains a powerful symbol of American ingenuity applied to the necessities of warfare. Its reliability under adverse conditions, stopping power, and rate of fire gave them confidence in their ability to accomplish their missions and return home alive. This personal connection explains why many veterans maintained a lifelong affection for the weapon, often seeking to acquire civilian versions after their military service concluded. The legacy of the M1 Garand extends far beyond its direct combat applications. Its basic design principles influenced virtually every service rifle developed after World War II, establishing semi-automatic or selective fire operation as the new standard for infantry weapons worldwide. Even as cartridges, materials, and manufacturing techniques evolved, the fundamental concept of providing individual riflemen with the means to generate substantial firepower remained constant. In military museums around the world, the M1 Garand occupies a place of honor as one of the most significant infantry weapons of the 20th century. Visitors who handle deactivated examples are often surprised by its substantial weight and robust construction, physical characteristics that reflect its development in an era when durability and reliability took precedence over lightweight or ergonomics. For collectors and firearms enthusiasts, original World War II-era Garands have become prized possessions, their value increasing as the generation that carried them in combat passes into history. Organizations like the Civilian Marksmanship Program in the United States have made surplus Garands available to civilian shooters, ensuring that this historical weapon remains part of living memory rather than being confined to museums and textbooks. The final assessment of the M1 Garand's impact must acknowledge both its technical advantages and its limitations. While superior to the bolt-action rifles it faced, it was not without flaws. Its weight, fixed magazine capacity, and the distinctive ping sound when ejecting an empty clip have all been criticized by later analysts. Yet these shortcomings pale in comparison to its revolutionary contribution to infantry combat, putting the firepower of a semi-automatic rifle in the hands of every infantryman, not just specialists or elite troops. For Oberleutnant Friedrich Conrad and Technical Sergeant Paul Hendricks, these technical debates would have seemed academic. They experienced the practical reality of the M1 Garand on the battlefield, where its advantages translated directly into tactical outcomes. Their story, representative of countless similar encounters across the European theater, reminds us that warfare is ultimately conducted by individual human beings whose effectiveness is shaped by the tools they carry into battle. As the final echoes of World War II fade into history, the lessons learned from weapons like the M1 Garand remain relevant to modern military planners and historians alike. The principle that infantry should be equipped with the best possible tools, even at significant cost, has become a cornerstone of Western military doctrine. The recognition that incremental technical advantages can create decisive tactical disparities continues to drive weapons development worldwide. In this context, the encounter between American troops with their Garands and German defenders with their carabiners in the Hürtgen Forest serves as more than just an interesting historical anecdote. It represents a case study in how industrial capacity, technological innovation, and tactical application combine to shape the outcome of modern conflicts. The shock experienced by officers like Conrad when facing the previously underestimated firepower of American infantry provides a cautionary tale about the dangers of failing to accurately assess an opponent's capabilities. The story of the M1 Garand is ultimately a human story of designers like John Cantius Garand, who created it, workers who manufactured millions of them under wartime conditions, soldiers who carried them across the battlefields of World War II, and opponents who faced their devastating effectiveness. Through their collective experience, we gain insight into one of the most significant transitions in modern military history, the moment when the semi-automatic rifle became the standard infantry weapon, forever changing the nature of ground combat.